Hello, this is Dr. Grande. Today's question is, can I analyze the case of Marty Markowitz? Just a reminder, I'm not diagnosing anybody in this video, only speculating about what could be happening in a situation like this. If you enjoyed this video, please like it, subscribe to my channel, and consider supporting me on Patreon. I will put the link to Patreon in the description for this video. First, I'll go through the background of this case, then I'll offer my analysis. Marty Markowitz lived in New York. His family had owned a business that supplied fabrics to theatrical productions. When both his parents died, Marty was feeling overwhelmed by his new responsibilities in that business. He was having trouble navigating relationships with other members of the family who wanted to take control of the business. On June 26, 1981, Marty started being treated by a psychiatrist named Isaac Hirschkopf, who went by the name Ike. Ike had graduated from medical school in 1975 and was licensed in 1978. Marty told him about his concerns and feelings. According to Marty, Ike said, "I'll take care of everything." Marty thought that Ike would be a good choice as a clinician because he claimed to take a direct approach with his clients. Many years later, a journalist named Joe Nocera purchased a vacation house in the Hamptons, which was next door to Marty's house. Ike was frequently at Marty's house as well. Joe would see Marty taking care of the grounds and just assumed he was the property manager and that Ike was the owner of the house. Sometime later, Joe would learn that Marty was actually the owner. Joe investigated and discovered a complex tale of manipulation and power. The story of Marty and Ike was reported by Joe Nocera in a podcast called The Shrink Next Door. A TV series by the same name was also created, starring Will Ferrell and Paul Rudd. It's worth noting that Ike would later say that 90% of the podcast was untrue or out of context. Here's what happened in the case of Ike and Marty, according to Joe Nocera and Marty. Ike crossed boundaries in the therapeutic relationship with Marty to take control of Marty's life. Over the course of years, Ike isolated Marty from family and friends. He controlled romantic relationships, restricting Marty from having a girlfriend. When Marty would go on a date, Ike would accuse the woman of trying to get Marty's money. I could picture Ike saying something like, "She can't take your money because that's my job." The amount of control that Ike exerted over Marty ended up causing Marty's sister, Phyllis Shapiro, to become suspicious. She also worked for the fabric company. Phyllis went to see Ike for a therapy session, but realized that he could not be trusted. Ike convinced Marty to reduce her wages and not to invite her to important events. She allegedly removed money and gold from joint bank accounts, which gave Ike an opportunity to convince Marty to cut Phyllis off once and for all. It seems as though Phyllis removed those items because she was afraid that she wouldn't get anything, that Marty would completely cut her off. Ike made himself the president of Marty's company, Associated Fabrics Corporation, and took an active role in making important business decisions. Ike was added as a joint owner on Marty's Swiss bank account. The account had about $900,000 in it. Marty would later say he was spending 6 or 7 hours a week with Ike. The clinician had convinced Marty to act as a servant. For example, he had Marty transcribe manuscripts Ike had written. Most of them were never published. Print invitations for parties at Marty's house, hosted by Ike. Guests thought that Marty was hired to help with the parties. Marty would serve drinks and cook the food. Before these parties, Ike had the house decorated with photographs of himself and his family, as well as other memorabilia connected to him, as if the house was his. Some of the photographs featured Ike with people like Gwyneth Paltrow, O.J. Simpson, Brooke Shields, and Henry Kissinger. Ike had Marty create a private foundation. Ike managed the money for that foundation. He used some of that money to make a donation to an upscale school that his 3 daughters attended. Ike had Marty rewrite his will, leaving his estate to the foundation. Later, he had Marty change the will again so that Ike's wife would inherit Marty's entire estate. On top of all this manipulation and exploitation, Marty was paying Ike about $100,000 a year for the therapy. The relationship between Ike and Marty continued until 2010. By this time, Ike had collected over $3 million in fees from Marty. That was just for being his psychiatrist. That didn't include other losses incurred from Ike managing Marty's money. Around this time, Marty went in for surgery to repair a hernia, and he noticed that Ike did not contact him at all in the days following the surgery. It's almost like he didn't care how Marty was doing. Marty sent Ike a letter telling him he had no desire to continue being his client. Ike insisted that Marty was making a bad decision, but Marty did not change his mind. Marty was able to reconnect with his sister Phyllis after he had escaped the influence of Ike. He tried to make sure that Ike would be held responsible for his actions. In 2012, Marty filed a complaint with the New York State Department of Health. 7 years later, they started to investigate his claims. I think this is a fairly good indication of how seriously they took the complaint. That's New York State's version of, we'll get right on it. After the investigation finally did start, it continued for 2 years. The Department of Health charged Ike with 16 specifications of professional misconduct, which involved the treatment of 3 different clients. So not all of the charges were related strictly to Ike's behavior toward Marty. The charges included negligence, gross negligence, incompetence, gross incompetence, exercising undue influence, moral unfitness, and a failure to maintain a patient record. In April of 2021, Ike's medical license was revoked. Now moving to my analysis. This is one of those cases that exemplifies how influential clinicians can be to clients, and how when that influence is abused, it can cause damage over an extended duration. Ike maintained some level of control over Marty for 29 years. Joe Nocera started researching the story in 2012. As I mentioned, he owned a house next to Marty's house and had contact with Ike and Marty. Not long after Joe moved in, Joe and his wife were invited to Marty's house to see Ike. Marty stopped by their house and said a very important psychiatrist wanted them to come over. They, of course, believed Ike was the owner of the house. During the visit, Joe and his wife had an interesting experience. Ike revealed a lot of information about himself. The couple described him as talkative. Before they left, Ike wanted a photograph with Joe, probably because Joe was a well-known journalist. Later, when Joe was writing the story, he interviewed Ike one time and communicated via email. At this point, Marty had filed a complaint against Ike. The clinician claimed he didn't understand why Marty turned on him. Why was Marty so angry? He thought everything was good. Ike represented himself as the victim. He suggested that Marty was blaming him unjustly, saying that if he was doing something wrong, why didn't Marty stick up for himself? Ike suggested that Marty was a smart guy. He should have known better. Ike also accused Marty of killing animals who wandered into his backyard and threatened his koi pond. So I guess Marty had this koi pond, and Ike was saying that Marty was violent when animals would come in. Marty, of course, had a different point of view. He said that he didn't like confrontations. He noted that Ike did help him with his problems, which is ironic. Ike helped him to get better with confronting people, but not better at confronting Ike. Marty said Ike represented himself as his big brother. He looked out for him. He protected him. In the end, Marty said he felt as though he was in a cult. He implied that he was trapped in the relationship with Ike. When considering the information about this case contained in the podcast, one is left with the sense that Ike was arrogant, condescending, self-centered, and had a sense of entitlement. He presented himself as a larger-than-life figure, a famous person who deserved to be admired and honored. He liked hanging out with high-status people. For example, he would show people pictures of himself next to celebrities. Perhaps Ike came to believe his own nonsense. He was convinced of his own greatness and believed that people like Marty should be happy to serve him. This has led some people to believe that this was all just a misunderstanding. Ike didn't mean any harm. He was just very enamored with himself, and that mentality led to this unhealthy relationship. Some people argued there was no intent, so this was just an expression of his personality. What I find interesting with this argument is that in 1986, Ike created a pseudonym, Isaac Stevens, that he used for some of his financial dealings with Marty. Why would somebody who's just involved in a misunderstanding require a pseudonym? It makes it seem like there was intent to avoid responsibility. Moving to the next question, how does this happen? The Department of Health implied that Ike had little insight or remorse. If this is true, how did he become a clinician in the first place? Typically, someone who lacks insight would be screened out during their mental health training program. I think this highlights one of the key differences between traditional therapy providers like counselors or social workers and psychiatrists. The vast majority of psychiatrists don't spend time providing psychotherapy. They mostly write prescriptions. Therefore, in that community, there is not as much of an emphasis on gatekeeping as far as therapeutic skill. Various features of a student's personality that may be destructive can be easily overlooked. Once a poor practitioner is able to get past what little gatekeeping there may be, they're pretty much free to do whatever they want. Once a professional is licensed, it's very unlikely they will ever lose that license. Revocation is highly unusual. In the rare cases when a license is revoked, it often takes years. We see in this case that the Department of Health didn't even bother investigating for 7 years and took another 2 years to revoke Ike's license. I think there are a few reasons for this. Many states have concerns about alienating physicians. They don't want to appear to be overly zealous in defending the public, because if they do, physicians will not operate in that state. They will simply go somewhere else. What has emerged from these fears and market dynamics is a reluctance to take complaints seriously. There's a tendency for states not to investigate thoroughly. In rare cases when they do, and the clinician is found at fault, there's not much of a penalty. I think it really says something about the system that Ike could do what he did to Marty and not lose his license for 9 years after the complaint. The message that a client may take away from the state's behavior is that the client needs to help themselves if they get into a bad relationship with a clinician. They should not depend on the state to help them out. What's tragic about this message, of course, is that the clinician has a tremendous amount of power in that relationship. The power differential means that the client is at a disadvantage. If the state does not want to protect the client, then the client is at the mercy of the clinician. Now moving to my final thoughts in this case. This case was really about crossing boundaries. It is unreasonable to expect clients to know when boundaries are being crossed by clinicians because many clients come to treatment to get help in that area, to get help establishing and managing boundaries. When a clinician crosses boundaries, they are attacking the client where the client is the weakest. Some people are of the mindset that Marty Markowitz really should have known better. Yes, Ike was responsible for the most part, but who lets a clinician control them for 29 years? I think this really speaks to the power of trust, the power of believing someone is acting in your best interest, the power of perceived friendship. It was only when Marty realized that Ike was not his friend that Marty cut Ike off. There should have never been the expectation of friendship in the first place. I think Ike was able to set the expectation early in the relationship. Marty saw some improvements. He felt as though Ike was helping him. He was getting better, so he didn't question Ike's methods. When Ike encouraged Marty to distance himself from other people, he denied Marty the opportunity to gain other perspectives about what was happening in that therapeutic relationship. Over the course of 29 years, Marty may have believed the relationship was normal and necessary. His beliefs had been shaped by a clinician turned manipulator. Those are my thoughts on the case of Marty Markowitz. Please put any opinions and thoughts in the comment section. They always generate an interesting dialogue. As always, I hope you found my analysis of this topic to be informative. Thanks for watching.